There comes a moment in every great thinker's life when the very ground beneath them breaks apart. For Carl Jung, that moment came the day he walked away from Sigmund Freud, his mentor, his intellectual father, and the man who saw him as his heir. Jung had been promised the future, the title of Freud's successor, but in a single decision, he chose to turn his back on everything he had built, everything he had been told he was meant to become. This was not just the breaking of a relationship, it was the tearing apart of his own identity. Jung, at the height of his career, felt his mind slipping, but rather than resist, he leaned into it. He ventured into his unconscious and faced the terrifying unknown forces that resided there. In doing so, he uncovered truths that changed not only the trajectory of his life, but also the course of psychology itself. But there's something deeply fascinating about this. He didn't share it with the world, not immediately anyway. For 50 years, Jung kept his revelations locked away in a secret book. Today we're going to unravel why Carl Jung chose to hide this monumental work, why the world wasn't ready for the Red Book, and what it teaches us about the journey to self-understanding. And by the end of this journey, you'll realize this book wasn't just about Carl Jung. It's about you. Unravel. You see, Jung wasn't just a man who studied the human psyche. He lived it. He experienced it on a level most of us will never fully understand. When he walked away from Freud, he wasn't simply rejecting the intellectual framework that Freud had created. He was rejecting the very way of thinking that had shaped his life until then. For Jung, that was the beginning of a descent, not into madness, but into self-awareness. He called it his confrontation with the unconscious. To fully grasp the importance of this journey, we need to understand the stakes. Jung wasn't just questioning a theory or a method. He was confronting the very foundation of his being. Imagine everything you thought you knew about yourself, about your life, your relationships, and your place in the world, suddenly crumbling. You stand at the edge of the abyss, not knowing whether you will fall or rise. That's what Jung faced in the early 20th century, and what he uncovered in his descent was so profound, so unsettling, that he kept it hidden for years. Jung's decision to walk away from Freud and plunge into the depths of his unconscious is where the story begins, and it's a story that still speaks to us today. Because let's face it, how many of us have been in a place where everything feels uncertain, where the world around us no longer makes sense? How many times have you felt like your life was falling apart, like your mind was telling you things you couldn't quite grasp, but you knew you had to listen? Jung's story is in many ways our story. But this wasn't just about his personal crisis, it was about a crisis of the soul, a crisis that Jung knew every person would have to face eventually, whether they were ready for it or not. Jung's journey started with withdrawal. He didn't just leave Freud, he also retreated from society, from his patients, from the very world he had once been so deeply immersed in. He needed space to understand what was happening within him, and so he withdrew to the solitude of a lakeside retreat. For hours he sat alone, lost in his own thoughts. But as he did, something stirred inside him. It was as if the very depths of his soul were rising to the surface, demanding to be heard. Jung began to realize that what he was experiencing wasn't just an intellectual crisis, it was a personal one. The familiar world of reason, logic, and scientific explanation no longer seemed to offer any answers. He felt as though something was bubbling up from below, a storm within, an ancient force that he had no choice but to face. He described it as the feeling of plummeting down into the depths. The more he retreated into this inner world, the more vivid his experiences became. Jung wasn't just having thoughts or dreams, he was experiencing psychic realities. These weren't mere hallucinations, they were real in the sense that they tapped into something much larger than himself. He felt as though he was being pulled into a realm where time, space, and logic no longer applied. He began documenting his experiences, not just in words but through images, drawings, mandalas, and visual representations of what he was seeing. This was no ordinary journal. It was his red book, the record of his own descent into the unconscious. But it wasn't just a collection of strange visions and dreams. It was a guide to the deepest parts of himself, a map of his own soul, which he had never truly understood until that moment. And that's where the Red Book becomes so significant, not just as a personal artifact of Jung's journey, but as a tool for transformation. For Jung, the unconscious wasn't something to be feared or dismissed. It was something to be understood, and what he uncovered was far more than just psychological knowledge. It was spiritual, it was mythic, and it was human. But what could this mean for you? If you've ever felt lost, unsure, or at odds with the world, you're not alone. Jung's descent wasn't just a personal one, it was an archetypal journey, one that every individual must go through to reach self-realization. Jung believed that this confrontation with the unconscious wasn't optional. It was a necessary part of the process of becoming whole. But it wasn't easy, it wasn't neat, it was messy, painful, and terrifying. Jung's story is one of transformation, of becoming something greater than the sum of one's parts. It's a story of shadow, of facing parts of yourself that you would rather not see. But in doing so, you come to understand the most profound truth of all. Wholeness is not about light without dark, it's about integrating both. Jung's descent into his unconscious was not a quiet one. It was filled with visions, vivid, disturbing, and undeniably real. As he delved deeper into his inner world, he experienced what he called psychic realities, a term that distinguished these visions from mere hallucinations. Jung was seeing things that couldn't be explained by science, but that didn't make them any less real. He saw images of rivers of blood flooding Europe, apocalyptic scenes of destruction, and encounters with strange and powerful figures that were not bound by time or place. In one vision, Jung encountered a serpent, an archetypal figure representing the primal, untamed force of the unconscious. The serpent was not an enemy, it was a mirror, reflecting back Jung's deepest fears, desires, and truths. This was not a simple mythic image, it was a living presence, a psychic reality that Jung had to face. These visions were not easy to interpret, they were terrifying and incomprehensible at times, but Jung knew they held the keys to his transformation. His mind was telling him something crucial, something far beyond his ability to understand at that moment. He had to listen, and it wasn't just the visions themselves that held power. It was the way they interacted with his psyche. Jung was not just an observer of these psychic realities, he was a participant in them. He began to engage with the figures that appeared to him, entering into dialogue with them, seeking their wisdom. This is where Jung's method of active imagination came into play. Active imagination was Jung's way of engaging with his unconscious. It was a process of dialoguing with the unconscious, not through rational thought or analysis, but through the imagination. Jung would close his eyes, enter a trance-like state, and allow his inner world to manifest. He would then interact with the figures, symbols, and images that appeared in his mind, allowing them to speak to him, teaching him what he needed to know. One of the most significant figures to appear during this period was Philemon, an old man with wings who became Jung's inner guide. Philemon wasn't just a figment of Jung's imagination, he represented something far more profound. He embodied the wisdom of the unconscious, a wisdom that Jung had to learn to listen to. Through Philemon, Jung learned that wisdom doesn't come from acquiring new knowledge, it comes from remembering what you've forgotten. It's about accessing the deep, buried wisdom within the soul. This was a transformative realization for Jung. He wasn't just a man trying to make sense of his inner turmoil, he was a seeker, guided by a deep, ancient wisdom that he had to learn to trust. But not all of Jung's visions were as serene as Philemon. Some were much darker, images of violence, rage, and the parts of himself that he had long ignored or repressed. These visions were his shadow, The shadow is a concept that Jung is perhaps most famous for introducing. It represents the parts of ourselves that we deny, reject, or push away. These parts are often primitive, dark, and unpleasant, qualities we don't want to acknowledge about ourselves. But for Jung, the shadow wasn't something to be feared or avoided. It was something to be integrated. One of Jung's most terrifying visions was of himself as a wolf, a murderer, a liar, and a beast. These visions represented the parts of himself that he had denied, the parts of him that he had repressed in order to maintain a civilized identity. But Jung understood that to achieve wholeness, he would have to face these parts of himself. He couldn't just bury them and pretend they didn't exist. Wholeness, he realized, wasn't about light without dark. It was about integrating both. The shadow is often misunderstood. It's not just a collection of negative traits or destructive impulses. It also holds deep truths about who we are. Jung famously said that the shadow is 90% pure gold. By confronting and integrating the shadow, we gain access to a deeper, more authentic part of ourselves. It's about reclaiming the parts of us that we've denied and bringing them into the light. This process is not easy. It's terrifying, as Jung discovered, but it's also liberating. By confronting the shadow, Jung was able to access a deeper level of personal power and wisdom. He realized that the unconscious wasn't his enemy, it was his ally, guiding him toward wholeness. Jung's journey wasn't just about confronting the shadow, it was also about discovering something far more profound, the divine within himself. As Jung delved deeper into the unconscious, he began to experience visions of God, not as an external, distant being, but as a psychic presence within the unconscious itself. For Jung, God wasn't something out there to be worshipped. God was something to be discovered within, in the very depths of the soul. In his visions, Jung encountered a dying God, a figure that symbolized the death of the old external conception of God. This wasn't a rejection of spirituality, it was a transformation of it. Jung realized that spirituality wasn't about belief in a distant deity, it was about transformation. The self was the new temple, and the divine was within. This realization was a turning point in Jung's journey. It wasn't just about integrating the shadow, it was about discovering a new, more expansive vision of the self. Jung had to let go of his old rigid ideas about God and embrace a more fluid internal conception of divinity. This was the beginning of his shift from psychology to mysticism, from the study of the mind to the study of the soul. As Jung continued his journey into the unconscious, he encountered another figure, Salome, the personification of his anima, or feminine soul. The anima was the unconscious feminine aspect of the male psyche, a figure that could not be controlled but must be surrendered to. Salome was not just a seductive woman, she was a symbol of intuition, feeling, and softness. For Jung, this was a profound realization. The soul, he discovered, is feminine. It's not about control, logic, or reason. It's about surrendering to something greater, something that can't be grasped by the mind, but must be felt with the heart. Jung realized that to become whole, he had to listen to the feminine voice within himself. He had to surrender to the unknown, to embrace the mysteries of the soul. This encounter with Salome was a pivotal moment in Jung's journey, one that helped him understand that true transformation isn't about controlling or mastering the self. It's about surrendering to it, listening to it, and allowing it to guide you. Jung's journey was far from over. He had confronted his shadow, discovered the divine within, and embraced the feminine soul. But there was still one more challenge awaiting him, a challenge that would require the death of the ego and a final surrender to the soul's wisdom. But what did this really mean? What happens when you let go of everything you thought you knew about yourself? We'll explore that in the next part of our journey. As Jung continued to descend deeper into the unconscious, he encountered a profound moment of transformation, one that many describe as the death of the ego. This wasn't a physical death, of course, but a symbolic one. Jung realized that in order to achieve true wholeness, he would have to let go of the very identity that he had spent his life constructing, the identity of Carl Jung, the intellectual, the psychologist, the hero. The process was terrifying. Ego death is not a gentle experience. It is the shattering of everything you thought you knew about yourself. For Jung, this meant facing the terror of unbe, a state of emptiness and total dissolution. It was the end of the persona, the end of the carefully constructed image of self that had protected him for so long. But in this void, something new was born. This moment is perhaps the most daunting and the most important for anyone on the path of self-realization. It's the moment when you strip away the masks you wear, the roles you play, and the beliefs you cling to. You are left with nothing but the raw, vulnerable truth of who you are, or rather, who you are becoming. Jung's ego death was the beginning of a new kind of life, a life rooted not in the old self, but in the real self. And this process wasn't just theoretical for Jung, it was visceral, real, and transformative. His life would never be the same again, but through this experience, Jung discovered the essence of who he truly was, something far deeper and more profound than anything he had understood before. After the death of the ego, Jung entered a state of direct communion with his soul. This was the turning point, the true homecoming. His soul was no longer a distant, abstract concept. It was present, active, and real. It spoke to him in quiet, wounded whispers, revealing truths that were both painful and beautiful. Jung began to realize that the soul wasn't just a passive observer of life. It was the essence of his being, the source of his creativity, wisdom, and authenticity. It had been there all along, buried beneath the layers of ego and societal expectations. But now, in the silence of ego death, the soul could emerge, fully and completely. The soul, Jung discovered, was feminine in nature, intuitive, receptive, and deep. It wasn't something to be controlled or analyzed. It was something to be listened to, something to be in relationship with. Jung's soul was wounded, honest, and full of longing. It wasn't perfect or pristine. It was real and raw, and that's what made it so powerful. Through this communion with his soul, Jung found peace. He found a deep, abiding truth that transcended everything he had learned before. He found wholeness. And in doing so, he discovered the true meaning of individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, not who the world tells you to be. This is the essence of Jung's journey, not the conquest of the unconscious, but the surrender to it, the acceptance of all parts of the self, even the darkest and most uncomfortable ones. And through this acceptance, he became whole. His soul returned to him, and he returned to the world a different person, a person who had been transformed from the inside out. So why did Jung keep the Red Book hidden for 50 years? Why did he never publish it, despite the monumental personal and psychological insights contained within? The answer is simple, yet deeply profound. Jung understood that the Red Book was not just a book, it was a spiritual weapon. It was raw, personal, and far too powerful for the world as it was at the time. Jung knew that the world wasn't ready for such a deep and radical exploration of the unconscious. He feared that people would misunderstand it, misinterpret it, or even dismiss it as the ravings of a madman. He didn't want to be seen as a prophet or a lunatic, but there was something else. Jung also knew that the Red Book was sacred. It wasn't meant to be consumed as an intellectual artifact. It was meant to be experienced, to be lived. The Red Book wasn't just about psychology. It was about personal transformation. It was an invitation into the unknown, a guide to facing the darkest corners of the self and coming out the other side whole. Jung kept the book hidden because he understood that this journey wasn't for everyone. It wasn't something you could simply read and understand. It was something you had to live. He knew that only those who were ready to confront their own unconscious, to face their own shadows, could truly appreciate the wisdom contained within the Red Book. As we come to the end of Jung's journey, I want to leave you with a question. What is your soul trying to tell you? Just like Jung, you are on your own path of self-discovery. You may not be facing the same apocalyptic visions or engaging with ancient gods, but you are facing your own inner struggles, your own fears, your own shadow, and just like Jung, you have the power to confront them. The journey toward wholeness is not easy. It is messy, it is uncomfortable, and it is often terrifying, but it is the most profound journey you can undertake. If you've ever felt lost, if you've ever wondered what it means to truly know yourself, then this journey is for you. So I encourage you to engage with your own inner world. Take a moment to reflect. What parts of yourself have you repressed? What aspects of your personality have you denied? And what would it look like if you fully integrated those parts, accepted them as part of who you are? I invite you to share your reflections in the comments below. Finish the sentence. My soul is trying to tell me that. And if this video resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with others who might benefit from this journey. Let's explore this path together, one step at a time. Remember, this isn't just about Carl Jung. This is about you. The journey to wholeness, to self-realization, to living authentically. It's a journey we all must take. And just like Jung, you will encounter your own shadows, your own gods, and your own soul. But through it all, remember, you are not alone. We are all in this together.